Hey everyone, it's Miss Carlson. Today I'm going to talk to you about Chapter 3, the Biosphere, which covers matter, energy, and the interdependence between those in nature. Again, as always, make sure you have a Cornell note-taking template or a blank sheet of paper to make yourself a template to take good notes. When we're all done, make sure you have a section off to the side to write good questions that can be answered by using your notes to later on use as review. So let's go ahead and get started with section 1 of chapter 3. It basically just describes to you what ecology is. It is a scientific study of the interactions among organisms and between organisms with their physical environment in mind. All life on Earth and all the parts of the Earth in which life exists, for example, land, water, and our atmosphere, we collectively like to call the biosphere. And that actually extends about 8 kilometers above the Earth's surface to as far as 11 kilometers below the surface of the ocean. Now, it would be next to impossible to actually study the entire biosphere at once, so if you were to become an ecologist someday or somebody who studies ecology, they usually focus on a particular level of organization within the field. I have them listed here from smallest to largest, and a lot of them probably sound pretty familiar to you. Starting off with species being the smallest, or an individual organism. You have a population when you have a group of individuals of the same species in a given area. Community would then be different populations in a defined area. An ecosystem then builds off of that. You have several communities together with their physical environment. So now the difference here with ecosystem, we have the communities and the environment all at the same time that we're focusing on. And then a biome would be a group of ecosystems that share similar climate and typical organisms. Now, we've looked at levels of organization at a cellular level. So we had initially focused on molecules, cells, tissues, and organs. Now we're jumping in and focusing in on this middle part, which, like I said, is what ecologists will study. Now, there are two main factors that we discuss when we're describing an ecosystem. They are biotic factors and abiotic factors. Both of them affect each other, but you need to know the difference between the two. And bio is a prefix that usually is in reference to something that is alive. So biotic factors are things that are living in the environment, and then abiotic factors are things that are not living in a particular environment. And here I have a picture of examples of living things that might be in an ecosystem, like a tree, bees, rabbits, grass, flowers, whatever it may be. Non-examples would be things like the sun, a rock, clouds, water. Those things are not living. So we have biotic versus abiotic. They do affect each other though. Now 3.2 covers energy producers and consumers. So again, this is a topic that you should have some knowledge of. And we learned the other day that primary producers are organisms that need energy for growth, reproduction, and are able to do this with their own metabolic processes. Now, primary producers are very essential to life because they basically put energy in a form that we can acquire. And if we didn't have energy, there would be no life. Sunlight is our ultimate energy source and is where our primary producers are able to get our energy from. So primary producers are also generally known as autotrophs, and we're usually talking about algae, certain bacteria types, and more commonly plants. And usually when we discuss things in class, we're probably going to reference plants as being our primary producers more often than the algae and the bacteria. So we call them primary producers because they are the first producers of energy-rich compounds that we, as other organisms that consume something else for our energy, are able to use. And if you look at this ecological pyramid here, notice that the producers are at the bottom. And they're at the bottom because they have the direct energy source at their disposal, because they can make their own food, hence autotroph. All the rest of the organisms, the primary consumers, secondary consumers, tertiary consumers, that tells you that they have to eat something in order to get their energy. So we will talk more about those different types in a second here. Now, it's important to note, and we talked about this back in Unit 3 last semester, most primary producers harness their energy from sunlight through photosynthesis. There is an exception to that, though, and that is a process called chemosynthesis, which is where organic compounds are made without a light source, and that's from the oxidation of inorganic or organic material. Usually we're talking about bacteria that's in the deep ocean where light cannot penetrate. And it is believed that these bacteria could possibly be the oldest life forms on Earth. So that's general good to know information. We're not going to get a whole lot into chemosynthesis. Now, what are consumers? I briefly mentioned them in the ecological pyramid just a second ago, but they are organisms that acquire energy through ingestion in one way or another. And so we call the autotrophs organisms that can make their own food. Consumers are called heterotrophs, and there are all different kinds of heterotrophs. Carnivores will kill and eat other animals. Herbivores usually eat plants, leaves, roots, seeds, fruits. Omnivores can eat both. Scavengers consume carcasses of other animals, so basically animals that have just died. Decomposers usually include bacteria and fungi. They feed by chemically breaking down organic matter. And then detritivores feed on detritus particles, which is any kind of waste or debris that may be laying around. The earthworm is a very common detritivore that you would be familiar with. Now, 3.3 talks about a very important aspect of understanding the interactions between organisms and their environment, and that is energy flow within the ecosystem. And you need to know that energy flows through an ecosystem in a one-way stream. It goes from the primary producers to the various consumers, and a lot of times, again, we show that in a pyramid so that you can see how that energy does flow. We also use food chains, which are a series of steps in which organisms transfer energy by eating or being eaten. And a food chain is just what it sounds like. It's just a chain of organisms that are eaten by one another, and the energy is passed on in that way. Now, here in this picture, we actually have a food web, which is more complex than a food chain because it involves several food chains, and it is more likely to show a whole ecosystem or a community, not just one singular chain of events like a food chain does, hence the name. Now, like I said, the trophic levels within an ecological pyramid do a great job of showing you how energy is passed on, how much energy is passed on, and then how it gets lost. Each step in that food chain or food web is what we call a trophic level. And like you can see here, the producers are always going to make up the first level because they're getting the energy source from the sun, and then other consumers eat to pass on that energy. Various consumers then will occupy the other trophic levels, depending on the organism type, and we just see the relative amount of energy or matter that is contained within those trophic levels for that particular food chain or that particular food web. So if we look closer at this, again, we have to have energy from the sun, and the producers will acquire that for us. And then the rabbit here in this case would be a primary consumer, the first organism to consume something else for energy. Then the snake here that would eat the rabbit would be known as a secondary consumer because it is the second organism that is consuming something else for food. And then finally, in this particular food chain, you have the eagle at the top, and it is a tertiary or the third consumer, or the third organism eating something for energy. Notice, though, in each case, you have heat loss. So energy does get released as heat, and what ends up happening as you go up in a pyramid, you have less and less energy being passed on. Notice the 1,000 kilocalories, 100 kilocalories, down to 10 kilocalories. So the organism at the top of the food chain, or pyramid as we're looking at here, usually has to consume a lot more food than the rest of the organisms because they're not getting as much energy from what they're consuming. All right, here's a different way to look at a pyramid and see the heat loss and how much energy is actually being transferred from one level of consumer to another. Again, we have a primary producer at the bottom it gets 100% of energy because it's getting it directly from the source or the sun. Then your first level consumer only gets about 10% of that energy because it's either being used by the producers or being released as heat. Second level gets about 1%, third level gets about 0.1%. So again, third level, secondary level consumers usually have to eat more food than the primary consumer, simply because there's just not as much energy being passed on because it's being used by the previous organisms. This pyramid is either referred to as a pyramid of numbers, associating the amount of organisms in each trophic level for that particular area or food chain. And then it's also can be looked at as a biomass pyramid. You can see how much matter is actually available per that system that you're looking at. Now, the last thing we're just going to briefly cover, because we're going to talk more about it in class and you guys are somewhat familiar with it, are the cycles of matter covered in section 4 of chapter 3. We've learned that living organisms are composed mostly of 4 elements: oxygen, carbon, hydrogen, and nitrogen. They usually form water, carbohydrates, lipids, nucleic acids, and proteins, things that are very important to us as living things. But where do all of those items come from? And basically they come from matter being recycled through the biosphere. And this is very different than the way energy moves, because like I said, energy goes one way, but matter can actually be recycled. And it's passed on from one organism to another through what we call biogeochemical cycles or processes. And this picture here does a very good job of showing you that energy is a one-way stream and just goes over a group of organisms and it's gone. But matter will actually continue to recycle itself and pass on from one organism, one environment to the next. And these biogeochemical cycles can be represented in biological processes, geological processes, chemical and physical processes, and human activity. And again, like I said, it's always recycled. In class, we're really only going to focus on the water cycle and the following nutrient cycles: carbon, nitrogen, and phosphorus. An important term you're going to need to be familiar with is what a limiting nutrient is when we start talking about these cycles. Basically, it's a nutrient whose, if their supply is limited, the productivity of a primary producer will also be limited, and therefore there would be a limit on the amount of energy that could be passed on in a particular cycle. Otherwise, we're going to cover more of this later, and that will wrap us up with chapter 3. Please go back and listen, replay, pause as needed to get down some good notes, and I will see you next time.